Johnny Cash lived life on his own terms, a legend forged in fire, faith, and raw emotion. But in his final days, the stage lights faded, and his world became one of solitude, reflection, and an unbreakable bond with music. With over 90 million records sold, a voice that defined generations, and the iconic Man in Black legacy, Cash's journey was unparalleled. Yet, as time wore on, loss and illness tested the strength of the man who had once seemed invincible. This is the story of Johnny Cash's last days, a time of pain, resilience, and unwavering devotion to his art. Even as his body weakened, his soul burned brighter than ever, leaving behind a final masterpiece that would etch his name into eternity. What does a legend do when the end is near? He sings, he remembers, he endures. This is Johnny Cash in his final chapter. Johnny Cash was never meant for an ordinary life. Born in the dirt and struggle of the Great Depression, he grew up in the cotton fields of Arkansas, where hard work and hardship shaped his soul. Music became his escape, his salvation, and soon his destiny. With a voice like thunder rolling across the plains, Cash sang the songs of the working man, the outlaws, and the broken-hearted. His lyrics were poetry wrapped in grit, tales of love, redemption, and rebellion. He wasn't just a singer, he was a storyteller, a voice for the lost and weary. Fame found him in the 1950s as his sound carved a place between country, rock, and folk. Hits like I Walk the Line and Folsom Prison Blues turned him into an icon, a man whose music could shake a prison wall or bring tears to a crowded arena. He was magnetic, raw, and real, never polished, never perfect, but always unforgettable. But the road to greatness came with a cost. Temptation followed him, and addiction became his shadow. The pills, the reckless choices, the self-destruction, it all nearly took him under. He became the outlaw in his own songs, a man running from himself. The world saw the legend, but inside, Johnny Cash was unraveling. Then came June. June Carter was more than just a fellow musician. She was his lifeline. Their love was forged in music, tested by turmoil, and bound by something greater than either of them. She saw past the darkness, past the mistakes, and into the man he could be. She pulled him back from the edge, helped him find faith again, and stood beside him as he rebuilt himself from the ashes of his own destruction. With her by his side, Cash found redemption, not just in music, but in life. He sobered up, found God, and poured his soul into his art like never before. The Man in Black became more than just a singer. He became a symbol of resilience, of second chances, of standing for something greater than himself. But even as the years passed and his body grew weaker, that fire inside him never dimmed. Through decades of triumph and hardship, Johnny Cash remained what he had always been: a fighter, a storyteller, a legend. And in his final days, as time ran short, he would prove once again that the Man in Black never backed down. Not from pain, not from loss, not even from the end itself. By 2003, Johnny Cash had walked through fire and come out the other side. He had conquered addiction, defied the odds, and stood tall through decades of triumph and turmoil. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. On May 15, 2003, the love of his life, June Carter Cash, took her final breath. The woman who had saved him, the one who had given him strength when he had none left, was gone. And with her, a part of Johnny Cash vanished too. For 50 years, she had been his anchor, his guiding light. Her laughter, her kindness, her unwavering belief in him. June was more than his wife. She was his salvation. And now, without her, he was adrift. The world saw a man who had always been larger than life, but those closest to him saw the weight of grief sinking deep into his bones. His hands trembled. His voice, once strong and steady, grew fragile. He barely ate, barely slept. He sat in the quiet of their home, surrounded by memories that refused to fade. Her voice still echoed in the hallways. Her scent lingered in the air. He was haunted, not by regret, but by love, by the unbearable emptiness of losing the one person who had ever truly understood him. In one of his last interviews, his voice cracked as he spoke. "The pain of her absence is unbearable, but I have music to keep me company." And so, he turned to the only thing he had left: his songs. With his body failing and his heart broken, he stepped into the studio, determined to record while he still could. Every note, every lyric carried the weight of a lifetime. He sang with sorrow, with reverence, with the kind of depth that only comes from knowing the end is near. Then came Hurt. Originally written by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, Cash took the song and made it his own. It was a confession, a reckoning, a man looking back on his life, his regrets, his mistakes, and his love. With every strained syllable, he bared his soul. The world watched, stunned, as the music video for Hurt was released. A frail Johnny Cash sat at a table, surrounded by relics of his past. Old film reels flickered with images of his youth, of June, of the life he had built, and the time that had slipped away. It was raw, it was devastating, it was beautiful. Trent Reznor himself admitted, "That song doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to Johnny Cash." His family and friends saw the change in him. He had always been strong, always defied the odds. But now he was tired. He had lived a life fuller than most could ever dream. But without June, the fight was slipping from his spirit. Johnny Cash wasn't afraid of death. He had faced it too many times, looked it straight in the eye and walked away. But now, with the love of his life waiting on the other side, he knew his time was coming. The man in black had lost his queen, and soon he would join her. In his final months, Johnny Cash lived in quiet solitude at his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. The house, filled with decades of memories, became both his sanctuary and his prison. Once, it had echoed with music, laughter, and June's presence. Now it was silent, except for the sound of his own breath and the music he refused to stop making. His body was failing him. Diabetic neuropathy had stolen his strength, leaving him bound to a wheelchair. His hands, once steady enough to strum his guitar for hours, shook with every movement. His eyesight was fading, the world around him growing dimmer by the day. And yet, despite the pain, despite the loss, Johnny Cash still had work to do. Every morning, he rose before the sun, the way he always had. He moved slowly now, every step a battle. But he never let it stop him. The first thing he reached for wasn't a guitar. It was his Bible. He would sit by the window, flipping through the worn pages, absorbing every word. Faith had always been his foundation, but now, in these final days, it was his lifeline. After hours of reading, he turned to his second ritual: letters. He wrote to his children, his grandchildren, old friends, bandmates, and the people who had shaped his journey. He poured out his thoughts, his gratitude, his memories. Some letters were filled with love, others with regret. But each one carried the weight of a man who knew his time was running out. Then the music called to him. The studio had become his sanctuary, the one place where he still felt alive. Even when his voice cracked, when the notes didn't come as easily as they once did, he refused to stop. Every song was a farewell, every lyric another goodbye. He recorded knowing these would be his last words to the world. Between takes, he would sit by the window, staring out at the Tennessee landscape. He had traveled the world, played for millions, stood on the grandest stages. But here, in the quiet of his home, he found himself drawn back to the past, to the Arkansas cotton fields of his childhood, to the Folsom Prison stage, to the first time he ever saw June Carter smile. He didn't speak much in those days. There was no need. His songs were saying everything for him. He didn't fear death. He had made peace with it. He knew where he was going. He knew who was waiting for him. And so, he pressed on. Writing, recording, remembering, until the very end. In his final years, Johnny Cash found an unlikely creative partner, producer Rick Rubin. A man known for his work with rock and hip-hop artists, Rubin saw something in Cash that others had overlooked. He didn't want the polished Nashville sound. He wanted the raw, unfiltered truth of Johnny Cash's voice. Together, they created the American Recordings series, a stripped-down, intimate collection of songs that reintroduced Cash to a new generation. No frills, no distractions, just a man, his voice, and his stories. But it was the fourth album in the series, American 4, The Man Comes Around, that would become his final masterpiece. Among its tracks was a song that no one expected him to record, Hurt, originally written by Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails. A song born in the industrial darkness of the 1990s, transformed into a haunting farewell in the hands of Johnny Cash. When he stepped into the booth to record it, his body was failing him, but his spirit burned brighter than ever. His voice cracked under the weight of the lyrics, but he sang them anyway, knowing this was more than just another song. This was his confession, his reckoning, his last great act of storytelling. The music video became something else entirely. A funeral before the funeral. Cash sat at a table, surrounded by the remnants of his life. Gold records, old photographs, and faded memories. His hands trembled as he poured wine, a quiet reminder that time had taken its toll. Footage of his younger days flashed across the screen, moments of triumph and regret playing out like a lifetime unraveling in front of him. And then there was June. Footage of her watching over him, her presence lingering even in death. She had always been there, his greatest love, his saving grace. Now she was gone, and the sorrow in his eyes told the world everything it needed to know. When Trent Reznor saw the final video, he was speechless. The song he had written in the depths of his own pain no longer belonged to him. That song doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to Johnny Cash. It was more than just a cover. It was a man laying his soul bare, a farewell letter to the world. He had spent his life telling the stories of others, but Hurt was his own. With every note, every frame of that video, Johnny Cash faced his mortality head-on. He didn't run from it, he embraced it. And in doing so, he gave the world one final masterpiece, a reminder that even as life fades, the music never dies. On July 5, 2003, Johnny Cash stepped onto a stage for the last time. His body was frail, his steps unsteady, but the fire that had carried him through a lifetime of music still burned inside him. The Carter family fold in Virginia was not a massive arena or a grand farewell tour stop. It was home, a place filled with history, tradition, and memories of the woman he loved. The room was packed, but the silence was heavy. Everyone there knew they were witnessing something special, something final. Johnny Cash, the man in black, was about to give the world his last performance. He settled into his chair, adjusting the microphone. His hands trembled as he gripped his guitar. But when he spoke, his voice, though worn by time, carried the same weight it always had. The spirit of June is still with me. I love her, and I know she is waiting for me. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet. A shared moment of grief, of love, of understanding. June had always been by his side, in life and now, even in death. And on that night, he made sure the world knew that she was still with him. Then, he began to sing. The opening chords of Ring of Fire filled the room, slow and deliberate. This wasn't the fiery, energetic version the world had come to know. This was something different, sadder, heavier. A man reflecting on the love that had defined his life. The lyrics carried a new weight, each word spoken with the understanding that the woman who had written it was no longer there to hear it. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. He wasn't just performing, he was saying goodbye. Then came I Walk the Line, the song that had started it all, the song that had carried him through decades of fame, failure, love, and redemption. The rhythm was slower, the delivery softer, but the meaning had never been clearer. Every word was a promise, one he had made and one he had kept. The audience sat frozen, watching, listening, feeling every note. Some wiped away tears, others simply nodded, knowing they were witnessing history. This wasn't just another show. This was the final chapter of a story that had spanned generations. He finished the song, let the last chord linger in the air, then looked out at the crowd. There was no grand farewell, no long speech, just a moment, a final look, a silent acknowledgement that this was the end. Then he gave a nod, one last gesture of gratitude, and left the stage. No encore, no final bow, just a man who had given everything he had to music, walking away for the last time. The world didn't know it then, but this would be Johnny Cash's final performance. The last time he would hold a guitar in front of an audience, the last time his voice would fill a room. But even in that moment, as he disappeared behind the curtain, his legacy was already immortal. He had sung through pain, through loss, through the weight of a life fully lived. And though his time was running out, his music, his story, would never fade. For Johnny Cash, this wasn't just a performance, it was a farewell, a love letter, a moment of strength. And now, it belongs to history. In the final weeks of his life, Johnny Cash was a man walking a path only he could understand. His body was failing him, but his mind remained sharp, his heart still heavy with memories, his soul still tethered to the music that had carried him through decades of hardship, triumph, and love. Doctors urged him to rest. His health was fragile, his energy waning, but Johnny Cash had never been one to surrender. Not to pain, not to time, not even to death itself. He had spent his life defying the odds. And in his last days, he refused to change. Every morning, he was wheeled into his home studio, determined to record while he still could. His voice was not what it once was. Time had taken its toll, stripping away the deep resonance that had once commanded arenas. But what remained was something even more powerful. Raw, unfiltered emotion. Every lyric carried the weight of a man who knew these were his last words to the world. He recorded tirelessly, pouring what little strength he had left into the songs that would become his final gift. Some were covers, others were reflections of his own journey, but all of them shared one thing in common. They were his truth. Each note, each lyric, each breath, a farewell. An acknowledgement that his time was running out, but his story was not yet finished. When he wasn't recording, he was surrounded by family. His children, his grandchildren, his closest friends. All of them knew what was coming, but no one dared to speak of it. They sat with him, filling the silence with stories and laughter, reminiscing about the life he had lived. The house, once filled with the warmth and laughter of June, now felt different. Her absence was everywhere. He spoke of her constantly, telling his family how much he missed her, how he could still hear her voice, feel her presence. Some nights, he sat by the window, staring out into the Tennessee landscape, whispering to her as if she were still there. He wasn't afraid of death. He had looked it in the eyes too many times to fear it now. But he longed for her. The ache of her loss was something even he couldn't put into words. He told his children that he knew she was waiting for him, that when the time came, he would see her again. On September 12, 2003, just 4 months after losing June, Johnny Cash took his final breath. The man in black, the outlaw, the poet, the preacher, his journey had come to an end. But his legend was only beginning. The news spread across the world in minutes. Fans gathered outside his home, leaving flowers, guitars, and handwritten letters. Some stood in silence, heads bowed in mourning. Others played his music, filling the streets with the sound of his voice one last time. Radio stations dedicated entire days to playing his songs. His records flew off the shelves, his voice filling homes, cars, and bars across the world. The music industry had lost a giant, but the world had lost something even greater. A man whose words had given voice to the lost, the broken, and the forgotten. His funeral was intimate, a reflection of the man he was. Family, friends, and fellow musicians gathered to pay tribute, not just to the legend, but to the man behind it. Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, and other longtime friends spoke of his kindness, his humor, his unshakable spirit. There were no grand spectacles, no elaborate tributes, just the way he would have wanted it. But Johnny Cash was never just a musician. He was a movement, a force of nature, a storyteller who had spent his life capturing the struggles and triumphs of the human experience. His music still plays in prison cells and church pews, in lonely bars and crowded arenas. It speaks to the lost, the weary, the hopeful, because Johnny Cash didn't just write songs, he told the truth. And truth, like legend, never dies. In the years since his passing, his influence has only grown. His songs are covered by artists across genres. His words still resonate with those searching for meaning. His life has been the subject of books, films, and tributes, each one attempting to capture the essence of a man who could never truly be defined. His final recordings, released posthumously, serve as a haunting reminder of his last days. A man staring down the end, yet still creating, still singing, still refusing to fade quietly. Songs like "God's Gonna Cut You Down" and "Ain't No Grave" feel like messages from beyond, proof that even in death, Johnny Cash had the last word. For some, Johnny Cash was the voice of rebellion. For others, he was a symbol of redemption. But for everyone, he was something rare, an artist who never pretended to be anything other than who he was: flawed, passionate, relentless. And though the man himself is gone, his presence is still everywhere. In the strum of a guitar, in the crackle of an old vinyl record, in the lyrics that refuse to be forgotten. Johnny Cash didn't just leave behind a catalog of music. He left behind a legacy of truth, of resilience, of stories that will be told as long as music exists. Because Johnny Cash was never just a man, he was a voice. And voices like his never go silent. Johnny Cash was more than a musician. He was a storyteller, a rebel, a voice for the lost and broken. His songs were not just melodies, they were confessions, prayers, and promises. His music crossed generations, from country to rock, from gospel to blues. He gave a voice to those who had none, telling the stories of the outlaws, the drifters, the prisoners, and the forgotten. He stood for something greater than fame, greater than success. He stood for truth. Decades after his passing, his influence is stronger than ever. His songs continue to resonate, covered by artists across genres, from rock legends to folk singers to alternative icons. His voice is still heard in movies, on radio stations, in homes, and on stages worldwide. New generations discover him every day, drawn in by the raw emotion, the unfiltered honesty, the timelessness of his music. Because Johnny Cash was never just one thing. He was a contradiction, fierce yet gentle, a sinner yet a man of faith, an outlaw with a heart that beat for redemption. And that contradiction made him real, made him relatable, made him unforgettable. His impact wasn't just in the music industry, he became a cultural icon, a symbol of resilience. He performed for prisoners, for presidents, for the people who needed to hear his words the most. He spoke openly about his struggles, his regrets, his faith, proving that even legends are human. His final recordings, stripped down and haunting, became his last gift to the world. Hurt, his raw, soul-bearing farewell, became one of the most powerful music videos ever made, a visual and lyrical testament to a man reflecting on the road behind him. His voice, weary but full of conviction, became a final chapter, a message that would outlive him. And so, his legacy lives on, in the chords of a guitar, in the voice of a young artist inspired by his words, in the records that still spin, in the songs that still move us. Because Johnny Cash didn't just write songs, he wrote the soundtrack to the human experience. And that soundtrack will never fade.